We at Sega Sports are pretty happy about the response to our new sports pack. One comes with a Genesis, or pick one with a Sega CD, and Joe Montana's NFL football. So you better get yours before things get ugly.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Sega CD review here on Player One Start. You know, in the last video I kind of wrapped things up quite a bit, and I thought to myself that I'll come back to the Sega CD sometime later on in the future. Well, I didn't realize how quickly I would be back, and it turns out it would have to be very soon because I forgot something in this review. Right as I was finishing up the final part of this series, I realized that I didn't include any sports games. And although I think this review would stand well without them, I would actually be doing a huge oversight to make it an ultimate review. And I think the biggest reason why it would be a mistake to skip the sports games is because of how important they were in Sega's success in the early to mid-90s. So before we start looking at any of the games, let's go ahead and take a look at kind of the rise of some of Sega's most popular sports games.
Welcome back to Sega Sports.
Hey, we're talking baseball. Sega Genesis Sports Talk Baseball.
Sandberg's facing Ryan. Here's the voice of Sports Talk Baseball.
291. High drive.
Sega Sports was a brand used by Sega to market sports video games during most of the 90s and early 2000s. First appearing in 1993, Sega used the Sega Sports name for about 10 years, following in the footsteps of Electronic Arts' EA Sports label. Electronic Arts had almost become a second-party developer for Sega's systems, going so far as to hack the hardware so they could produce and manufacture their own game cartridges, which also allowed them better deals on licensing fees than other developers. Sega of America had been using sports personalities to sell games since the launch of the Sega Genesis in 1989, with lucrative markets from the National American Football Leagues, baseball, basketball, and ice hockey leagues, and EA's proven business model of releasing sports games annually with updated teams and statistics. Sega of America chose to create a dedicated Sega Sports team to handle the production and marketing of sports software. This new distinction was to help position Sega as a trusted brand for sports titles, that it was dedicated to the genre, and that Sega consoles were the best place to play such games. Sega's rivals, such as Nintendo, who were not producing their own annual sports games at the time, could then be painted as being indifferent to the genre. And at a time where marketing drove the industry, having a huge range of up-to-date sports titles was considered a huge plus by Sega. And though Sega created this brand specifically for sports titles, not all sports titles produced by Sega used the brand. There were a total of about 11 sports games that used the branding on the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive. An additional 4 Sega Sports titles were released on Sega CD, and just a few released on the Sega 32X. What drove Sega's hardware to prominence with sports titles, though, had to be its third-party offerings from Electronic Arts. EA Sports got their start with launching their John Madden football game, being the most realistic football simulator available at the time, on various computer platforms, with one of the first ports to a console being on the Sega Genesis. Therefore, it was only natural that EA would also produce many sports games for the Sega CD as well. So, one of the biggest changes that Sega made when they were making the Sega Genesis from the Sega Master System is the fact that they were going to target an older key demographic. And this didn't mean people in their 30s and 40s older, this meant people older than 8 and 9. So this would have a huge, wide variety of age groups, and I think the biggest one they were going for were teenagers. And it would turn out that this group had a huge interest in sports. So if we were to put these games in one of Sega's self-defined genres, which one would it fit in? I think these would be actually more suited towards the enhanced cartridges. And since we're back on this topic, I am going to further clarify what exactly an enhanced cartridge is. According to Sega, an enhanced cartridge is any game that would basically use the same format of a Sega Genesis game, so the same kind of graphics, of course upgraded with the Sega CD hardware, but with a few key differences. The first being that it would use CD quality audio, or CD sampled audio, and it would sound much different than the stock sound chip on the Sega Genesis. The second enhancement to this cartridge game would be full motion video, and this is something that couldn't even be done on the Sega Genesis, with one notable exception. The Sonic 3D Blast had a full motion cutscene at the beginning of its game, but that was a rarity. Here's where we need further clarification. All of my examples I gave on screen when I was referring to this genre showed you a cartridge game next to its Sega CD port. And that's kind of something that's important to note. Sega didn't say that all of these were going to be upgraded versions of cartridge games. Some of these could be standalone titles that were only on the Sega CD and not the Genesis. So this genre actually includes both because they are enhancing the cartridge game style experience. Hopefully that further clarifies this point, as I did receive some comments stating that some of these games are only on the Sega CD. How can you say that they were an enhanced cartridge? Well, that's the reason why. ESPN Baseball Tonight is the only baseball game released for the Sega CD. It also had a Genesis port and made its way to other systems such as the Super Nintendo as well as PC MS-DOS systems. This game offers smooth gameplay and graphics, however, in terms of controlling and the actual gameplay, it is a bit frustrating. You have to be pretty spot on with your hits, and it is within pixel-perfect accuracy. This game gets pretty bad reviews, but I don't think it is all that bad. I would give it about 3 out of 5 stars, or a 60% rating. That's mainly due to the frustrations I had with this game, and the fact that there's kind of a big learning curve and it takes a while to get used to the controls. It doesn't have the pick up and play that I feel that a sports game should. And as playing against the computer can lead into nightmare territory, I would definitely recommend this with a second player.
He's safe! Check swing.
Ball one. 1-0.
Out of the two hockey games I have for the Sega CD, I think NHL 94 is probably the better way to go. And this game is often credited as being one of the best sports games from this time period, if not of all time. I credit that to its improved controls over previous versions, and an overall good presentation. It does have that pick up and play ability where somebody shouldn't have too much trouble getting used to how to control their characters, but provides a challenge that will keep you coming back for more. If you're a fan of hockey and you can find this game for either this system or the Genesis or Super Nintendo, I would definitely recommend that you pick up a copy of NHL 94 just to see for yourself how good this game actually is. NBA Jam was released on a variety of platforms and is the better basketball game here on the Sega CD. Though it was also released for the Sega Genesis as well as the 32X, I do like the Sega CD version for the fact that it does make a lot of improvements over the Genesis counterpart. The music sounds more like something you would hear in the arcade, and the graphics and scrolling seem to be a bit more smooth than on the Genesis. I also no longer feel like I'm tied to that 2D plane, actually having the ability to move in all directions. The game is not that difficult in my opinion, and I think it's something that will be welcoming to a lot of people who may not even be basketball fans. Overall, this is a worthy addition to your Sega CD collection, especially if you're a fan of the arcade-style sports games of the mid-90s. FIFA International Soccer is another great video game that was released in the mid-90s, and it also received ports for the Sega Genesis, as well as this port on the Sega CD. This game is virtually identical to the port on the Sega Genesis, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, as the original game was pretty good as well. Although this game is very well recognized for being a high-quality title, my only nitpick is that I do not appreciate the isometric perspective. It just plays tricks with my brain when I'm trying to push directions on the D-pad. It takes me a little bit to catch up on where my character should actually be moving. However, that is not a problem that is unique to this game, as any game using this perspective will have that issue. In terms of football games, I would recommend Joe Montana Football, but I decided to go ahead and feature one of these ESPN titles as well because the football version is actually not that bad.
Hi, I'm Chris Berman, and welcome to ESPN Sunday Night Football. Tonight's matchup will be a quick one. Why? Each of our ball clubs loves to run the football.
All 28 teams that were in the NFL at the time during the early 90s are in the game. However, the names of individual players are not, but I don't think that's going to be as big of an issue for people playing today. I do believe that the visuals in this game, particularly the graphics of the football field, could have been done a little bit better, but the overall gameplay style is very similar to other football games of the time.
Incomplete.
Links for the Sega CD.
As far as golf games are concerned, Lynx is the only one I could find on this system, and it plays pretty well. It actually reminds me a little bit of like the Microsoft Golf simulators that came on Windows 95 back in the day, and I found that a bit nostalgic, although I do think that players playing it today might get a little bit bored with it, as the graphics aren't as realistic as we're used to seeing today.
Get out your snorkel. That's destined for the hazard in the water.
Fans of wrestling in the mid-90s will appreciate the WWF Rage in the Cage as the only wrestling game available on the Sega CD. Although I think this will appeal best to those that were fans of the WWF back then, as they'll be able to see some of their favorite wrestlers that maybe have been retired for several years by now. But I was surprised to see a few of them that are still active to this day, at least as of the time of this review. The controls here are pretty straightforward, although it took me a little while to figure out how to pin my opponents. Again, I feel this is one of those titles that is best played with 2 players.
1, 3.
Alright, so what are my thoughts on these games on the Sega CD? Let's get this out of the way first. I personally do not appreciate sports games on the Sega Genesis, and I think this is partially due to the fact that I'm not a really big sports fanatic in real life either. The draw for me on these games is the retro nostalgia. Yes, some of these games are still fun to play, and I do appreciate the retro style that they're made in. But these games were made to be the most realistic that they could do with the hardware at the time, and we could do so much better today. So if you're going for realism, that's completely going to be lost on you, and unfortunately, the rest of what these games have to offer isn't going to satisfy the average game player. Some of my reasoning and justification behind this opinion is the fact that you don't see people making sports games like these today, do you? So while I feel that these games are very important in the success that Sega had in the early to mid-90s, I don't think they are worth it today to start collecting them. Fortunately, they are cheap if you want to go out there and prove me wrong, but overall, I'm not a big fan of the sports games on this system, so I have a hard time recommending them to others. And of course, most of my opinion is contingent on one point, and that is, sports games are best played with 2 players. And since I am playing all of these by myself, that is actually heavily influential on why I don't enjoy them. I think that the enjoyment factor of these games goes way up when you're playing it with someone else and have a shared common gaming experience. But that said, that is going to wrap it up for this video. If you like what you see, please click that like and subscribe button. Again, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and stay tuned because I have more content coming. I'll see you all in the next one. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, if you enjoy the content of this channel, please remember to click on this subscribe button. Again, I want to thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.